The rope around Amma's wrists had been there for 3 days. Not tight enough to cut the skin, but tight enough to remind her every hour that she was no longer a person in the eyes of the men who held the rope. She stood in a holding yard behind a red brick building on a narrow street in Richmond, Virginia, in the year 1845, and she counted the pigeons on the rooftop across the alley, the way she used to count the fishing boats coming into harbor back home. It was the only thing she allowed herself. Counting, not feeling, not remembering, just counting. There were 11 pigeons. The man who ran the yard was called Crane, Jedediah Crane. He was not a tall man, but he had a voice that traveled. One of those voices that fills a room the moment its owner decides to use it, the kind that makes other men stop talking without knowing why. He wore a brown coat with brass buttons, and he kept a small ledger in his left breast pocket at all times, because to Crane, every person in his yard was a number waiting to find its correct place on a page. He walked the yard each morning the way a farmer walks a field, unhurried, assessing. He stopped at each person, looked them over, wrote something in the ledger, moved on. When he stopped in front of Amma, he was quiet for a moment longer than usual. She kept her eyes level, not defiant, just level. There was a difference, and she had learned it early. Defiance got you punished. Level eyes got you watched. She preferred to be watched. It was harder to forget a person who held your gaze. "This one," Crane said to the man beside him, a young assistant named Petrie who wrote faster than he thought, "goes on the platform tomorrow morning, front of the line." Petrie wrote it down. Amma heard this and felt nothing move inside her except the very quiet, very practiced part of herself that had been keeping accounts since the night 3 years ago when her world fell apart. She did not know it then, standing in that yard with 11 pigeons on the roof and the smell of sawdust and clay in the air. But the next morning was going to change more lives than her own. It was going to change the life of a woman she had never met, who was at that same moment sitting in a carriage 2 miles away, pressing her thumbnail into the leather of her glove and trying to keep her expression calm. Margaret Whitfield was not calm. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 18 months of her life doing something that could have landed her in serious trouble if anyone had thought to look closely enough at her correspondence. And she was now sitting across from her father in a hired carriage while he talked about property values and the morning's business. Her father, Edmund Whitfield, was a large man who believed in efficiency the way some men believe in God. Absolutely. Without requiring evidence, and with no patience for people who questioned it. He had brought Margaret because her mother was unwell, and because someone needed to carry the document satchel and keep the accounts in order. Margaret was, in her father's estimation, extremely good at keeping accounts in order. He was not wrong about this. He just did not know what kind of accounts she was actually keeping. The carriage stopped on Franklin Street, and Edmund Whitfield stepped out first, straightening his coat. Margaret followed with the satchel. The street smelled of horses and early morning bread from a bakery 2 doors down. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Richmond. Somewhere nearby, a church bell struck 8. "We'll deal with the estate business first," her father said, already walking. "The lawyer's office is on the next block. I have a separate matter at the auction house afterward. You can wait with the carriage." "Of course," Margaret said. She had no intention of waiting with the carriage. The estate business took an hour and 40 minutes. Her father's old business partner, a man named Barclay, had died without a clear will, and Edmund Whitfield was one of 3 men with a claim on a portion of the resulting settlement. The lawyer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, laid out the terms. Edmund Whitfield argued 2 of them. Margaret sat in the corner chair and kept her face politely neutral and listened to every word. When it was done, her father received a bank draft. He tucked it into the document satchel, looked at his watch, and handed the satchel to Margaret. "Hold this. I'll be back within the hour. There's a matter at Crane's I want to see to." "I'd like to come," Margaret said. Her father looked at her the way men looked at inconvenient weather. Briefly, without interest, already mentally moving past it. "It's not a place for a lady." "Neither is a lawyer's office, some would say," Margaret replied pleasantly, "and yet here we are." Edmund Whitfield was a man who, when faced with a certain specific kind of calm female logic, found it easier to walk forward than to argue. He had spent 26 years developing this response to his daughter. "Fine," he said. "Stay near me. Don't speak to anyone." They walked to Crane's yard. The auction block at Crane's establishment was a raised wooden platform set in a wide open room with high windows that let in cold morning light. There were already perhaps 30 men gathered, buyers, observers, men who attended these things the way others attended markets or livestock fairs. Most of them knew each other. They talked in low voices, some holding cups of coffee brought in from the street. Crane was already on the platform when they arrived. He was not yet speaking, just surveying the room with the satisfaction of a man who knows his audience. Behind the platform, through a door, were the people who would be brought out one by one. Margaret stood at the back of the room with her father. Edmund Whitfield immediately spotted two men he knew and moved toward them, lowering his voice into the register he used for business conversation. Margaret remained where she was. She held the satchel with both hands. She looked at the platform. She looked at the door behind it. She kept her face still. The first hour of the auction was a lesson in how human beings can train themselves not to feel things they know they should feel. Margaret had read about this in the pamphlets she helped circulate, the ones she wrote, though no one knew she wrote them. She had written about the psychology of complicity, about how ordinary people could stand in an ordinary room and watch extraordinary cruelty, and feel nothing more than mild interest or mild impatience. She had written those words at her writing desk by lamplight, and she had believed them. But believing a thing and standing inside it were not the same experience. She watched. She held the satchel. She breathed. Then Crane's assistant brought Amma out. Amma stepped onto the platform, and the first thing Margaret noticed was not her face. It was the way she stood. There was no performance in it, no fear shaped into submission, no anger shaped into bravado. She just stood there the way a tree stands, rooted, not going anywhere, not needing to explain itself to the wind. Her eyes moved across the room without landing on anyone in particular, and then they stopped, briefly, barely a second, on Margaret at the back. Margaret did not look away. Crane had been talking, pricing, describing, performing his usual showmanship. He glanced at his crowd. He was very good at reading rooms, and rooms with women in them required different management. He had perhaps 50 of these showman instincts, all developed over years, all deployed automatically. He spotted Margaret near the back, nicely dressed, young, the daughter of Whitfield, he noted. He knew Edmund Whitfield, knew his face if not his family. "We have a visitor today," Crane announced with a broad smile that he aimed at the whole room but directed, unmistakably, at Margaret. "A lady of quality, no less. What say we let the lady choose?" The room laughed. It was the easy, relaxed laughter of men who think something amusing is happening at someone else's expense. Margaret did not laugh. She looked at Amma on the platform. She looked at the room laughing around her. She looked at her father, who had turned from his conversation and was watching her with an expression that was just beginning to move from amusement to wariness. She looked back at Crane. "What is the price?" she said. Her voice carried. The room did not go quiet all at once. It went quiet in patches, like a fire being put out section by section, until the last murmur died, and everyone was looking at her. Crane blinked. Just once. Then he recovered, because he was a professional and professionals recover. He named the price. It was a significant sum. It was in fact the majority of the bank draft currently sitting in the satchel Margaret was holding. Margaret opened the satchel. She did not hesitate. She had not hesitated in her mind for the last 2 months, since she had received the confirmation from the network, the Quaker family in Philadelphia, the route, the timing, the papers. She had rehearsed this moment so many times in her own mind that her hands were entirely steady as she counted out the correct sum. She placed the money on the small table at the base of the platform. The room was perfectly, completely silent. Crane stared at the money, then he stared at her. He was, for the first and possibly only time that morning, a man without a script. Margaret's father had gone the color of old candle wax. Amma stood on the platform and watched a stranger purchase her freedom, and felt, not gratitude, not yet, not quite, something more complicated and harder to name, something that began with the recognition that the world, sometimes, does unexpected things. Sometimes it surprises you, not always kindly, not always safely, but sometimes, in ways that split the sky open. The transaction was completed in 7 minutes. Crane, to his credit, was nothing if not efficient when a decision had already been made. He signed the paper. His assistant signed as witness. Margaret Whitfield signed her name in the space provided. The document was folded and placed in her hand. Petrie scratched out the number in his ledger and wrote the new one. Edmund Whitfield said nothing in the room. He waited until they were outside, on the pavement, and then he said it quietly, in the voice he used when he was controlling something he did not want other people to hear. He said it with precisely chosen words that added up to, "You have spent money that was not yours, on a decision that was not yours to make, and I will not forget this." Margaret listened. She held the document. She said, "I know." Then she walked to where Amma stood being transferred from Crane's custody, and she said, in a low, even voice, "You are going north, tonight." Amma looked at her. She did not say thank you. She said, "How far north?" Margaret almost smiled. "Far enough that we won't be having this conversation again." In the hours that followed, the tense, careful hours of a Tuesday afternoon in Richmond while the city went about its ordinary business, two women who should never have intersected moved through the city in parallel, and the machinery of something that had taken 18 months to build began, at last, to turn. Margaret went to the address she had memorized, a cooper's shop on a side street, run by a quiet man named George Holder who made barrels by day and asked no questions when asked not to by people he trusted. She delivered the document. She passed the word. She answered 3 questions from Holder and then she left. She went back to the hotel where she and her father were staying. She sat in the small chair by the window of her room. She waited. Downstairs, she could hear her father's voice in conversation with the hotel manager. He had not spoken to her since the street outside Crane's yard. She knew, with a certainty that sat in her chest like a stone, that he would not speak to her in the same way again. Not because of anger exactly, but because a daughter who does something her father cannot understand or control becomes, in a certain kind of father's mind, a different category of person, not a daughter anymore, not quite. She was all right with this. She had known it was coming. She had known it since the first pamphlet she wrote, alone at her desk at 11 o'clock at night, when she understood that there was a line she was choosing to cross, and that once crossed it could not be uncrossed, and that she was going to cross it anyway. She opened her journal. She did not write about what had happened. She wrote instead about the pigeons she had noticed on a rooftop through Crane's window, 11 of them, gray and entirely unconcerned with the business of men below. She described their posture. She described the quality of the morning light. She did not write Amma's name. She had been trained by careful people never to write names. 2 streets away, in the back room of George Holder's cooperage, Amma sat on a low wooden bench and ate bread that someone had brought her and thought about what north meant. She had heard the word used for 3 years as a direction that was also a destination, a place that existed more as a concept than a geography. The way home had become for her, present in the mind, unreachable in the body. Now it was being offered to her as something actual, something with timing and a route and people at the end of it. She finished the bread. She looked at her wrists, where the rope marks were still faintly visible. She pressed her fingers against them once, firmly, as if confirming something to herself. Then she folded her hands in her lap and she waited, the way she had always been best at waiting, not passively, not helplessly, but with the attention of someone who is memorizing every detail of the room around her, because knowledge is the only possession that cannot be taken by force. George Holder moved quietly through his shop, locking the front door, banking the small fire, preparing for an evening that was going to require precision. Outside, Richmond went on being Richmond. People walked on the streets. Lanterns were lit as the afternoon darkened. A horse cart rattled over the cobblestones. A woman sang something from an upper window of a boarding house. The church bell struck 5. And somewhere in all of it, a plan that had been folded and refolded inside the mind of a 26-year-old woman for 18 months was, at last, opening itself out into the world. The pigeons on the roof of the building across from Crane's yard had all flown away by now. There were none left to count. But Amma, in the back of the cooperage on the side street, had stopped counting anyway. She had moved on to something harder and more necessary. She had started planning. George Holder did not talk much. This was the quality that had made him trustworthy to the network of people who moved carefully through the South like water moving through stone, slowly, invisibly, finding ways through gaps no one thought to guard. He had been a part of this particular network for 4 years, and in those 4 years he had helped 11 people begin the journey north. He kept no record of this. He kept no letters, no names, no dates. Everything lived in his memory, which he trusted more than paper and fire trusted wood. He brought Amma water and told her to sleep if she could. The floor of the back room was swept clean, and there was a folded blanket on the bench. He said he would return at 2 in the morning, and that she should be ready to move quickly and quietly. Then he left her alone. Amma did not sleep. She had not slept properly in 3 years, not the deep, restoring kind of sleep she remembered from before, the kind where you wake up feeling returned to yourself. Now she slept in short stretches, always listening, always half somewhere else. So she sat on the bench in the dark cooperage and she thought. She thought about her father, not with grief exactly, because grief requires a kind of stillness she had not been able to afford, but with the particular sharpness of someone who is carrying a memory the way you carry something fragile. Carefully, always knowing it is there, never quite putting it down. Her father had been a chief on the coast, a man of influence and careful alliances, a man who had made one alliance too many with one wrong person, and paid for it in the currency of his family. She had been the price of a negotiation she never knew was happening until it was already done. She had been 19. She did not think about the ship. She had a strict policy about the ship, and the policy was, not now, not here, not tonight. Tonight required her to be entirely in the present, in this room, on this bench, breathing this air that smelled of sawdust and the sharp, clean smell of new wood, waiting for 2 in the morning. She ran through everything she had been told in the last 2 hours. George Holder had spoken in a low, careful voice, using few words and long pauses between them. She was to travel on a farm wagon heading toward the Potomac. There would be 2 other people on the wagon, both free workers who knew the road and knew how to say the right things at the right times. She would be in a hidden space beneath the wagon bed. There would be blankets and water. The journey would take most of a day. At the end of it, she would reach a house, and at the house there would be someone who would give her food and the next instruction. She memorized all of it. Then she thought about the woman, Margaret Whitfield. Amma had seen many things in 3 years that she had not expected to see, and she had trained herself to process them without too much weight in either direction, without gratitude that made her dependent, and without resentment that made her slow. She tried to look at the woman the way she would look at any unexpected event. Here is what happened. Here is what it means. Here is what it requires of me next. What it meant was harder to determine. The woman had bought her, had spent a significant sum, had stood in a room full of men who thought the whole thing was entertainment, and had done it with steady hands and a steady face. That required something. Amma was not sure exactly what to call it. Courage seemed too small a word, and too easy. Courage was something you felt. What she had watched on the woman's face was something colder and more deliberate than feeling. What it required of Amma was alertness. Trust was a thing she extended carefully and withdrew fast, and she was not prepared to extend it to a stranger simply because the stranger had done an unexpected kindness. Kindness had been used against her before, by people who offered it with one hand and held a different intention in the other. She would watch. She would listen. She would move north, and when she was north, when she was somewhere she could stand still without fear, then she would decide what she thought. She pulled the thin blanket around her shoulders. The cooperage was cold, the way old brick buildings are cold in late autumn, a cold that lives in the walls and breathes out slowly all night. She sat with her back against the wall and watched the sliver of night sky visible through the small high window. 1 star. Then 2, as her eyes adjusted. She counted them, because it was something to do, and because Amma, who had counted pigeons and fishing boats and stars and the number of steps between rooms in every building she had ever been held in, understood that counting was not a small thing. It was how she kept herself organized, how she kept the self she actually was, separate from the self that circumstances kept trying to tell her she was. She was not a number in a ledger. She was not a name on a bill of sale. She was the person sitting in this cold room counting stars and waiting for 2 in the morning. At the hotel, Margaret Whitfield sat at the writing desk in her room and wrote a letter that was not addressed to anyone. She wrote it because she needed somewhere to put the afternoon, and her journal was not the right place for what she was feeling, which was several things at once, and not all of them comfortable. She felt something that she might have called relief, but it was the complicated kind of relief that comes after you have done a thing you were afraid to do, and the doing of it has not removed the fear, only changed its shape. She had been afraid before she walked into that building. She had felt the fear in her fingertips as she counted out the money, a fine trembling that she had controlled by breathing slowly and thinking about numbers. She was not afraid of Crane. She was not afraid of the men in that room. She was afraid of the moment not working, of reaching for the plan she had spent 18 months building and finding that it was not sturdy enough to hold. It had held, but there was still the journey north to manage. There was still the question of whether George Holder's people would move at the right time and reach the right place. There was still the route, which had 3 stages and 3 separate sets of people who needed to not make a mistake. And there was still Margaret's father, who was somewhere in this hotel right now, having a dinner he had not invited her to, speaking to people she would not meet, thinking thoughts she could probably guess at with reasonable accuracy. She wrote for about an hour. Then she put down the pen and went to the window. Richmond at night was quieter than Richmond in the day, but not silent. She could hear the occasional horse, the distant sound of a door. Somewhere a dog was barking at something it found important. The lamplights on the street below made small orange circles in the dark. She thought about what came next, not for Amma. That was as much in other people's hands now as it was in hers, and she had learned to release what she could not control. She thought about what came next for herself. She had been corresponding with a family in Philadelphia, Quaker friends of a woman she had met through a reading circle in Richmond the previous year. The wife of the family, a woman named Clara Holt, had over the course of 14 months become something close to a friend, at least as close to a friend as you could become through letters alone. Clara was practical, warm, and entirely without the kind of politeness that substitutes for honesty. She had offered Margaret a room in her house, should Margaret ever need one. Margaret had not told her father about Clara Holt, or the letters, or the offer. She thought she might be needing that room fairly soon. Edmund Whitfield came to her door at 9 o'clock that evening. She opened it, and he stood in the doorway, filling it the way large men fill doorways, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "I want you to understand something," he said finally. "I'm listening," Margaret said. "What you did today was not your decision to make." "The money was in the satchel," Margaret said. "The satchel was in my hands." "The money," Edmund said, with the slow deliberateness of a man controlling a very large and very specific anger, "was from the Barclay settlement. It was estate money. It was not yours." "Then you'll need to take it from the transaction, which is already complete," Margaret said. "Crane's already entered the numbers. The document is signed." Her father looked at her for another long moment. She met it. She was very good at meeting these moments. "I don't know you," he said, not unkindly, not cruelly. Just as a statement of new fact, the way a navigator states a change in the weather. "I know," Margaret said again. He turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. She watched him go, then closed the door, and stood in the middle of her room, and took 3 very long, very steady breaths. Then she went back to the writing desk and wrote one more page. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Clara Holt was reading a letter that had arrived that afternoon, not from Margaret but from the network, from one of the Quaker men who coordinated arrivals. A person was coming. She would need the room in the back of the house prepared. She would need food and clothes and patience. Clara read the letter twice, then burned it in the kitchen fireplace, which she did with all such letters, and then she began making up the bed in the back room. In the cooperage on the side street in Richmond, 2 in the morning arrived. George Holder arrived with it, moving quietly through the back alley with a man named Philip Graves, who drove the farm wagon. Graves was a free man who had made this particular journey 3 times before. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a face that told nothing to strangers. A skill he had cultivated with the same deliberateness that Amma had cultivated her level eyes. He said almost nothing as they prepared the wagon. The hidden space beneath the wagon bed was accessed through a hinged board, fitted so precisely that it looked, from the outside, like an ordinary piece of farm equipment. Inside it was narrow but not impossible. A grown person could fit with their knees drawn up, and there were small, carefully positioned gaps that allowed air to move. Holder looked at Amma. "Ready?" She looked at the space. She thought about the ship, then shut the thought down hard. This was different. This was going towards something. "Ready," she said. She climbed in. The board was fitted back above her. The wagon shifted as Graves climbed up to the seat. The horse moved. Richmond rolled away beneath her in the dark. Above her, through the boards, she could hear the sounds of the city thinning out. Fewer hooves, fewer voices. The cobblestones giving way to packed earth. The packed earth giving way to something that felt like open road. She counted her own breaths. She held her hands flat on her stomach and breathed in a measured rhythm that she had learned on the ship, in the worst days of it, when the only thing she could control was the pace of her own lungs. She was moving north. The wagon rolled on through the dark. In the city behind her, a hotel room lamp burned late into the night, and a young woman wrote in careful, measured sentences about things she would never send and never burn, things she was simply putting somewhere outside her own head so that she could sleep. In the end, Margaret Whitfield blew out the lamp at midnight. She lay on the bed with her eyes open for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city. Then she closed her eyes. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. The road north of Richmond was a long one, and it knew nothing about the people who traveled it. It did not care about the hour, or the cold, or the particular weight of the silence that settles on a person who is moving away from one life and has not yet arrived at another. It was just a road. Packed dirt, frozen at the edges in the pre-dawn hours of November, stretching ahead of Philip Graves and his wagon like a long conversation with no clear end. Graves drove with the unhurried steadiness of a man who understood that speed was less useful than calm. A wagon that moved at a measured pace attracted a different kind of attention than one that moved at a hurried one. Hurried wagons were noticed. Calm wagons were furniture. He had been doing this long enough to know that the road itself was rarely the danger. The danger was the unexpected stop. The checkpoint that was not supposed to be there. The question asked by someone who was curious for the wrong reasons. He had 3 answers prepared, as he always did. 3 simple stories, each plausible, each requiring nothing more than a steady face to deliver. He had chosen his 3 stories for this particular morning based on the time of day, the direction of travel, and the kind of farm business a man on this road at this hour could plausibly explain. He did not think about what was under the wagon bed. He had learned, early in this work, that thinking too specifically about the person underneath made his hands less steady. So he thought about the horse instead. The horse was a good one, a gray mare named something he had long since stopped thinking of as a name, because she had never responded to it anyway. She knew the road almost as well as he did. Under the wagon bed, Amma counted the sounds. This was different from counting pigeons or stars. This was a functional count, a survival count. The sound of hoofbeats, the creak of wood, the occasional crunch of ice under the wheel. She was building a map of the journey inside her head, the way she had built maps of every building she had ever been held in. She did not know exactly what the map would be useful for, but she built it anyway. She was cold, she was not hungry, because Holder had given her bread and dried meat before she climbed in, and she had eaten it with the methodical efficiency of someone eating for function rather than pleasure. She was not comfortable, but she was not, in this moment, afraid. Fear had been a constant companion for 3 years, and she had developed an intricate and practical relationship with it. She knew its weight, its texture, the specific places it settled in her body when it arrived. It was not there right now. What was there instead was something she would have called alertness, if she were the kind of person who spent a great deal of time naming her internal states. She was watching from the inside of a dark box, and she was watching with everything she had. The first stop came about 2 hours into the journey. Graves slowed the wagon. Amma heard voices, 2 men, exchanging a few words with Graves, the tone casual, the conversation short. She heard something about corn, about a farm, about the weather. Then the wagon moved again. She kept counting. By the time dawn began to gray the sky above the wagon, Amma had built a substantial internal map of the journey. She knew they had crossed a wooden bridge. She had felt it under the boards, heard the hollow sound of the wheels. She knew they had passed through at least one small town. The sounds of buildings, a dog, someone calling out a name to someone else. She knew they were moving steadily northward, partly from the cold, which was changing in quality as they went, becoming less the cold of a city with its contained heat, and more the cold of open land. In Richmond, Margaret Whitfield woke at 7 and lay still for a moment before she let herself think about the day. This was a habit she had developed, a brief pause between sleeping and thinking. Just a few seconds of simply being awake before the plans and worries and decisions rushed back in. She used it now. Then she let the day arrive. She needed to understand what her father intended to do. She needed to know if he planned to leave Richmond today or tomorrow. She needed to know if he was going to attempt to involve anyone official in what had happened. If he was, in his fury, going to try to undo the transaction by claiming some irregularity. She did not think he would. Edmund Whitfield was, above all, a man who did not invite scrutiny of his business dealings, and opening a challenge to a completed auction would invite exactly that. But she needed to be sure. She dressed. She went downstairs. She found her father already at breakfast in the hotel dining room, sitting alone at a corner table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. She sat down across from him. He looked up, assessed her, looked back at his newspaper. "We leave this afternoon," he said. 3 o'clock. "I'm not coming back with you," Margaret said. He put down the newspaper. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the night before. That same flat, considering look that had no warmth in it, but also no particular malice. It was the look of a man taking inventory. "Where are you going?" he said. "Philadelphia," Margaret said. "I have a friend there." "What friend?" "Clara Holt. Her husband is Edward Holt, a cloth merchant. They're a good family. They've offered me a room." Her father considered this. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "And when you've done whatever it is you think you're doing, you'll come back to Richmond." It was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement that pretended to be a question and then waited to see which way the conversation fell. "No," Margaret said. "I don't think I will." He looked at her again. She watched his face rearrange itself through several things it did not say. Then it settled on something that was very close to resignation. Not soft, not warm, but a decision made by a man who had identified the limits of what he was willing to argue about. "You'll receive no money from me," he said. "I know. I won't write." "I understand." He picked up his newspaper. It was a dismissal, delivered very quietly, and Margaret accepted it as such. She rose from the table, poured herself a cup of coffee from the sideboard, drank it standing near the window, and looked out at the street while her father read the news behind her. She did not feel grief about this. She had thought she would, and she did not. What she felt was something closer to clarity, the clean, uncomplicated sense of a decision that had already been made, confirmed in the open air of a fact finally spoken aloud. She went upstairs. She packed her bag. It was not a large bag. She had learned to travel with very little, partly for practical reasons and partly because she had grown to distrust the particular comfort of too many possessions. She packed her clothes, her journal, the document she had received from Crane's clerk, and a small book of essays she had been meaning to read for 3 months and had not yet opened. At noon, she went to the post office and sent a letter to Clara Holt in Philadelphia. The letter said only that she was coming, that she expected to arrive in 2 days, and that she hoped the room was available. It was brief enough that any stranger reading it would find nothing of interest. She took the 3 o'clock coach, not with her father. He had his own carriage. She bought her own ticket. She sat in the coach with 2 other passengers, a merchant and an elderly woman traveling to her daughter's house, and she watched Richmond disappear through the window and felt the particular feeling of a door closing behind you, not in anger, not in sorrow, but simply because you have walked through it and your feet are now pointing somewhere new. On the road north, the wagon that carried Amma had made good time. Philip Graves arrived at the first relay point, a farmhouse belonging to a man named Leonard Hatch, who ran a small operation on the edge of the Potomac watershed, just as the afternoon light was beginning to angle low and gold across the fields. Hatch met them at the barn, unhitched the horse, gave Graves something to eat, and went to release the hidden board. Amma climbed out slowly, because her legs had been still for hours and they needed a moment to remember their function. She stood upright in the cold barn air and stretched and said nothing. Hatch handed her a cup of broth. She took it. She drank it. She looked around the barn, the rafters, the 2 cows in the far stalls, the hay, the single lamp burning near the door. "You're safe here tonight," Hatch said. "In the morning, the next leg starts." Amma looked at him. He was a tall, angular man with a reddish beard and the permanent, slightly apologetic expression of someone who never quite knows what to say to people who have been through things he hasn't. She did not mind this. She had encountered many versions of it. "How many nights until the end?" she said. 3 more, he said. "Maybe 4. She nodded. 3 or 4. She could count 3 or 4. Graves ate quickly and left before dark to drive the wagon back to Richmond, before anyone noted his absence. He said nothing on his way out. Amma watched him go and thought that she was now in a chain of people she had never met and could never thank properly, each of whom had made a decision to be part of this and had done it quietly and without any theater. She found this more affecting than she expected to. Hatch showed her to a small room behind the barn. A simple thing. Barely a room at all. More of a large cupboard with a cot in it. But the blanket was thick, and the door had a latch, and Amma had not had a door with a latch in 3 years. She stood in the middle of the tiny room for a moment and looked at it. Then she sat on the cot. She pulled off her shoes. She lay down and pulled the blanket up to her chin. Outside, the wind moved across the open fields with the particular loneliness of flat land in November. Inside the tiny room, it was just quiet enough, just dark enough. For the first time since the cooperage, Amma felt the tight, watchful thing at the center of her chest loosen slightly. Only slightly. But it was enough to notice. She did not count anything. She slept. She dreamed about the coast, not the night of the betrayal, but earlier, much earlier, when she was a child, and her father would take her to watch the fishermen bring in their catch at dawn. The boats, the nets, the light on the water, the sound of her father's voice telling her the names of the fish in their own language. Words she had not spoken aloud in 3 years. Words that still lived somewhere very deep inside her like something buried well. She woke before dawn, in a room she did not recognize, in a country that was not her own, on a road that was carrying her toward a life she could not yet imagine. She lay still. She let the dream settle. Then she got up. Philadelphia announced itself first through smell. Margaret had noticed this on her previous visits. The specific layered smell of a river city, coal smoke and river water and horses, and the slightly sweet industrial smell of tanneries working on the western edge of town. The coach crossed the Schuylkill and descended into the city in the thin gray light of a November afternoon, and Margaret watched it come toward her through the window and felt, for the first time in 4 days, the specific luxury of being exactly where she intended to be. Clara Holt was waiting at the door of the narrow red brick house on Spruce Street when Margaret arrived in the hired cart. She was a small woman, not yet 40, with quick dark eyes and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago to be direct rather than decorative. She looked at Margaret, looked at the single bag, and said, "You look tired. Come inside." Margaret came inside. The house was warm and smelled of bread and wood smoke and lavender, and it struck Margaret with a force that was almost physical that she could not remember the last time she had been somewhere that smelled of ordinary domestic warmth without some kind of tension underneath it. She stood in the narrow hallway while Clara took her coat, and she thought, this is what relief actually feels like. She had forgotten. Clara fed her before she asked a single question. This was something Margaret would come to understand about Clara Holt over the coming weeks. She operated on the principle that people thought more clearly when they were warm and had eaten, and so she took care of the physical necessities first and the complicated conversations second. It was a very practical form of kindness. When there was bread and soup on the table and tea in the cups, Clara sat down across from her and said, "Tell me what happened." Margaret told her. She was concise about it. The auction, the money, the transaction, the document. She described Crane and the room and the silence that had fallen when she opened the satchel. She described her father's face on the street outside. She described the hotel room and the 3 o'clock coach and the fact that she had one change of clothes and her journal and a book of essays she still had not opened. Clara listened to all of it. When Margaret was done, Clara poured more tea and was quiet for a moment. "And you believe the route north is sound?" she said. "I believe in the people running it," Margaret said. "George Holder has done this before. Philip Graves has done this before. The relay points are established. The people at each stop know what they're doing." Clara nodded slowly, and the woman, Amma, "She knows what she's doing too," Margaret said. "That was evident from the first minute. When will you know she's arrived safely?" "When word comes through, Holder will send a message when she clears the last relay. We won't have names or details, just a word that the parcel has arrived." Clara nodded again. She turned her teacup in her hands once, then she said, "And what do you intend to do, now that you're here?" It was the question Margaret had been sitting with for 4 days, and she did not have a complete answer. She had the outlines of one. She knew she could not return to Richmond in any meaningful sense, not to her father's house, not to the social world she had grown up in, which was a world that would close around her absence without a ripple. She knew she had some money of her own, not much, but enough. The inheritance from her grandmother, held in her own name at a bank in Philadelphia because her grandmother had been exactly the kind of woman who thought a woman should have money in her own name. And she knew she had the work, the pamphlets, the writing, the careful, unsigned contribution to an argument she believed in more than she believed in almost anything else. "I want to write," Margaret said, "properly, not just pamphlets. I want to write something that has weight to it, that people will read more than once. I want to put on paper what I have seen with my own eyes." "That will require access to people who publish such things," Clara said. "I know. I was hoping you might know some of them." Clara looked at her for a moment, then she smiled. A brief, dry, entirely genuine smile. "I know most of them," she said. On the 4th day of Amma's journey north, she crossed the state border into Pennsylvania in the hidden space of a second wagon, this one driven by a woman named Ruth Baines, who was perhaps 50 years old and had the composed, self-contained manner of someone who had made an absolute peace with the life she was living and the risks it entailed. Ruth drove without apparent concern, and she sang quietly to herself for long stretches of road, hymns, old and simple ones, that Amma could hear faintly through the boards above. She found this unexpectedly calming. At the 3rd relay point, a Quaker farm north of the border, Amma was given a coat, a real one, wool, heavy, dark gray, with all its buttons present. She put it on, and stood in the doorway of the farmhouse for a moment, looking out at the cold, flat Pennsylvania fields, and tried to understand that she was on the other side of something. The farm was run by a couple named Owen and Patience Darby. They were quiet people who asked no questions beyond the practical ones. Was she hungry? Was she well? Was there anything she needed before the next morning? Owen showed her where to wash. Patience showed her to a room that had an actual window and an actual bed, not a cot or a blanket on a floor, but a proper bed with a proper frame, and Amma stood in the middle of it and felt the ground under her feet in a way that was hard to explain. She washed. She sat on the bed. She looked at her hands in the lamplight. Her hands had done many things in the last 3 years that she had not chosen and would not choose. They had been made to do work she would not think about now. But they had also done other things, things that were hers. They had repaired cloth when cloth tore, had braided hair, had broken bread, had written letters in the dirt with a stick when she needed to think and had no paper. They were her hands. They had been through things, and they were still her hands. She pressed them together in her lap and held them there. That night, for the first time in 3 years, she did not have to construct the quiet inside herself from scratch. It was already there, or something close to it. She lay in the bed and stared at the low ceiling and let herself exist without managing every detail of her own interior. It was exhausting, she discovered, to have no immediate emergency to manage. The tension that had been holding her upright for so long had nothing to grip now, and it did not release gracefully. It released in stages, each one accompanied by a physical shaking that she did not want and could not prevent. She lay very still and let it happen, and did not name it, and waited for it to pass. Owen Darby brought her soup through the door at some point in the evening, left it on the table without entering, knocked twice, and left. She ate it later when she was steadier. In Philadelphia, Margaret was sitting in a room above a print shop on Chestnut Street with a man named Arthur Pennock, who published a small but widely circulated abolitionist paper called the Northern Review. He was 53, had ink permanently under his fingernails, and read her first 3 pages in complete silence before he put them down and looked at her over his spectacles. "You were in the room," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "You're the woman who paid at Crane's." She had not intended this to be known, and her face showed it before she could stop it. Pennock saw this and made a small gesture with his hand. "Word travels," he said. "I have a correspondent in Richmond. Don't concern yourself. My correspondent is discreet. But yes, I know who you are, and yes, I know what you did, and that is a significant part of why I am interested in publishing what you write." "I'm not interested in being a story," Margaret said. "I'm interested in writing one." "Then write it," Pennock said. "Write exactly what you saw. Write the room. Write the faces. Write what it costs. I'll print it." She wrote it. She sat at the desk Clara Holt gave her in the back bedroom of the Spruce Street house, and she wrote what she had seen in Crane's room, and what she had seen in Richmond over 18 months of careful watching, and what she knew about the machinery of it, not from books, but from proximity. She wrote about what ordinary people looked like when they convinced themselves that ordinary cruelty was simply the way things were done. She wrote for 12 days without stopping except to sleep and eat. She wrote 32 pages. She revised them. She wrote them again. She gave them to Pennock. He read them in a single sitting and then sat quietly for a long time. "This will upset people," he said. "Good," said Margaret. He published it. The response to the piece was not immediately visible, because things published in 1845 traveled at the speed of paper and post and the deliberate passing of a document from hand to hand. But it traveled. It found readers in drawing rooms and church halls and small meeting houses from Philadelphia to Boston. It found readers who copied out sections and passed them on. It found readers who read it and then sat very still for a moment afterward, the way you sit still when something has rearranged something inside you. Somewhere in all this traveling, the piece found a woman in Ohio who would later write to Margaret and tell her that she had read it 7 times, and that each time it meant something slightly different and each time it mattered. Margaret kept that letter. She kept very few things, but she kept that one. The message arrived at Clara Holt's house on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Margaret had arrived in Philadelphia. It was a single folded paper, no envelope, delivered by a young boy who left it without waiting for a reply. It said, "The parcel has arrived in good condition." 3 words that were not 3 words at all. 3 words that were 11 days of cold and dark and wagon boards and strangers' doorways and broth in unfamiliar rooms and a gray coat with all its buttons. Margaret sat at the breakfast table and read the 3 words and then sat quietly for a long time. Clara came in, saw her face and poured her more tea without being asked. "She's there," Margaret said. "Good," Clara said. That was all. It was exactly enough. In Ontario, in the town of St. Catharines, where a small but steady community of people who had come north was building itself along the cold shore of the canal, Amma stood on a street she had never been on before, and breathed air that was, legally, freely, entirely hers to breathe. The man who had received her at the last relay point, a man called Henry Moss, a free black man who had been born in Toronto, and who had spent the last 8 years of his life coordinating arrivals at this end of the route, had brought her here by the most ordinary of means, a hired carriage on a public road in daylight. She had asked him about this. He had told her, with a quiet directness that she liked immediately, that the moment she crossed into Canada, the hiding was over. "You don't hide here," he said. "You walk." She walked. St. Catharines was not a large town, but it had a particular quality of life in it, a density of purpose, a community that had been forged out of exactly the kind of hardship that makes people either fall apart or hold together, and this one had chosen the latter. There were people here who knew what she had come from, not because she told them but because they had come from it too. There were people who understood the specific weight of the thing she was putting down without requiring her to explain it. Henry Moss brought her to a house on a street lined with bare November trees, where a woman named Grace Alderton ran a boarding house for newly arrived women. Grace was a formidable woman in her mid-50s, heavy-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been shaped by decades of making quick and accurate assessments of the people in front of her. She looked at Amma for about 3 seconds when they arrived at the door. "You'll need sleep and a proper meal," Grace said. "After that we talk about what you want to do." Amma came inside. The boarding house was full. 6 women, all at different stages of the same process, all in the slow and necessary work of building a life out of whatever they had arrived with, which was usually very little in the material sense and a great deal in every other sense that mattered. They ate together in the evenings. Some of them talked a great deal, some of them said almost nothing. Grace did not push any of them. She had learned that arrival was not a fixed point, it was a stretch of time, and the length of that stretch was different for every person. Amma was quiet at the evening meals for the first week. She listened, she watched the other women around the table, their faces, their gestures, the ways they held themselves, the things they laughed at and the things that silenced them. She was building the map again, but this time the map was not of rooms and exits. It was of people. It was of community. It was the first one she had built in 3 years that did not have survival as its primary purpose. On the 8th evening, a woman named Frances, who had arrived 3 months before Amma and had begun working at a dressmaker's on the main street, asked Amma if she had any skills that could translate into work. Amma thought about this. She said she knew how to manage an account. She had kept her father's trade records from the time she was 15, and numbers had always come naturally to her. She said she knew how to read and write in English, which she had learned on the estate where she had been held, in stolen minutes with a primer belonging to a child who left it carelessly around. She said she could cook, though she had not cooked food she chose for herself in a long time. Frances looked at her for a moment and then said, "There's a man on Division Street who runs a small trading office. He can't keep an account straight to save his life. Henry Moss told him to find someone competent. Would you like me to introduce you?" Amma said yes. The meeting on Division Street was brief and practical. The man, a merchant named Paul Weston, was in his late 30s, energetic, disorganized in the way of men who have ideas faster than they can execute them, and desperately in need of someone who could sit with a ledger and make sense of it. He showed Amma the accounts, which were in a condition that she could only describe, internally, as ambitious. She sat with them for about 20 minutes while Weston talked about his business. Then she told him what was wrong and how to fix it. He hired her on the spot. She started the following Monday. She walked to the office in the gray morning, sat at the desk, opened the ledger, and began. Numbers had their own logic and their own grammar, and that grammar did not change based on where you were or what had happened to you. A wrong sum was a wrong sum in Richmond or Toronto or St. Catharines. A balanced account was a balanced account everywhere in the world. She found this deeply, unexpectedly comforting. Weeks passed, then a month. The town became familiar in the way all places become familiar, not because anything dramatic happens, but because you begin to know which board on which street makes a different sound under your foot, and which baker puts too much salt in the bread, and which neighbor's dog barks at carriages but is afraid of bicycles. The ordinary texture of a place accumulates, and when it does, it means something has shifted. It means you are not passing through anymore. In Philadelphia, Margaret's piece in the Northern Review had found a second readership. It was being reprinted, in sections and in full, in 4 other newspapers that had asked Pennock's permission. Margaret had received 7 letters from strangers in response to it, all of which she read carefully and most of which she answered, and 3 of which she kept. She was working on a longer piece now. Not a pamphlet, not a newspaper article, but something that wanted to be a book. She had been trying to articulate to Clara exactly what kind of book it was, and the best she had managed was a book about the ways ordinary people make themselves comfortable with things they know are wrong, and what it costs everyone, including themselves, when they do. Clara had listened to this description and said that she thought it was a book that needed to exist and that Margaret should get on with writing it. Margaret got on with it. She wrote in the mornings, when the house was quiet and the light came in clean and cold from the east-facing window of the back bedroom. She wrote until noon, then stopped and ate and walked, because she had learned that she thought better on her feet than she did sitting still. She walked along the river in the afternoons, sometimes for hours, turning sentences over in her head, looking for the one that said the true thing in the clearest way. She thought sometimes about her father, not with grief, not anymore, but with a kind of anthropological curiosity that she recognized as the distant cousin of grief, the version you arrive at when the raw feeling has processed itself into something more analytical. She wondered what he made of the piece in the Northern Review, if he had read it, if he had recognized her. She had not signed it with her own name. She had signed it M. Whitfield, which was close enough that people who knew her would know, and opaque enough that strangers would not be able to find her. She had not heard from him. She had not expected to. She had, however, received a short letter from a cousin in Richmond, a woman named Helen, who was 2 years older than Margaret, and had always been the more socially conventional of the two. The letter did not mention the auction, or the piece, or any specific event. It said only that Helen hoped Margaret was well, and that she thought about her, and that the hydrangeas in the garden had bloomed unusually late that year. Margaret read this letter 3 times, each time finding something different in it, and then she wrote back a long and genuinely warm reply about Philadelphia in autumn, and the quality of the light on the Schuylkill, and the essays she had finally begun to read in the book she had packed months ago. The correspondence became a regular thing. It was the thread that remained when the fabric of her old life had unraveled, and she held it carefully. Amma, in St. Catharines, had begun to teach herself French. This was not a planned thing. It had begun because the family next door to the boarding house, the LeBlancs, who had come down from Quebec, had a daughter of about 7 named Cécile, who had no playmates her own age on the street, and who had developed the habit of standing in the doorway of the boarding house and watching the women inside with enormous, interested eyes. Amma had started talking to her, first in simple English, then, as Cécile's English proved minimal and Amma's curiosity proved extensive, in the halting French that Amma was picking up word by word from the child. Grace Alderton watched this without comment for 2 weeks, and then told Amma that there was a woman at the church on St. Paul Street who gave French lessons on Thursday evenings, if she was interested. She was interested. The lesson room at the church was cold and lit by 3 candles and contained, on her first Thursday, 7 other students of varying ages and motivations. The teacher was a woman in her 60s named Berthe Marchand, who had been born in France and had come to Canada 40 years ago and had opinions about everything. She taught the way people teach who cannot understand why anyone would find learning difficult, with impatience toward mistakes and immediate warmth when a student got something right. Amma sat in the 3rd row and applied herself to French with exactly the same focused attention she had applied to Paul Weston's accounts and to the ledger of Philip Graves's wagon, and to the map of the cooperage in Richmond. French was a system. Systems had rules. Rules could be learned. She was good at this. By spring, she was reading a French newspaper with the help of a dictionary. By the following summer, she was reading it without one. Paul Weston, delighted with the order she had brought to his accounts, gave her a small raise and introduced her to 2 of his business associates, both of whom had accounting problems of their own. By the end of her first year in St. Catharines, Amma had 3 clients and was keeping books for all of them. She had moved out of Grace Alderton's boarding house and was renting a small room of her own above a tailor's shop. She had bought 4 things for it: a table, a chair, a lamp, and a good wool blanket. Then she bought a piece of paper and a pen and an inkwell. She sat at the table in the lamplight and she wrote a letter to someone she had never met and did not know how to contact, whose name she only knew because George Holder had told her, quietly, in the cooperage, as she was preparing to climb into the wagon. Her name is Margaret Whitfield. She wanted you to know her name. Amma had kept the name in the back of her mind for an entire year, the way you keep a coin you are not ready to spend. Now she was ready. She wrote to Clara Holt's address in Philadelphia, because it was the only address she had, and she was not even certain Margaret Whitfield was still there. She wrote carefully, and without excess. She said she had arrived safely. She said she had work. She said the town was livable, and the winter had been longer than anything she had previously understood winter to mean. She said she was learning French. She thanked no one. She stated no debt. She simply wrote the facts. She sealed the letter and sent it. She did not know if it would arrive. She did not know if Margaret Whitfield was still in Philadelphia, or if she had moved on, or if the whole address was now irrelevant. She sent the letter anyway, because the sending of it was its own act, regardless of where it landed. It arrived. Clara Holt brought it to Margaret at the writing desk one morning, holding it with 2 hands as though it had some weight to it. Margaret looked at the handwriting on the front for a long time. Then she opened it. She read it twice. Then she sat at the desk for a while, not writing, just sitting. Then she picked up her pen and she wrote back. She wrote about Philadelphia, and the book, and the winter there, which had also been long. She wrote that she was glad the coat had been adequate. She wrote that she was glad the French was coming along, and that she had no French herself, and considered this a personal failing. She wrote 2 pages in her usual careful hand, which was somewhat more compressed and deliberate than most people's, and she sealed the letter and addressed it to the tailor's shop on the street that Amma had mentioned. She did not thank Amma for writing. She understood that Amma had not written to be thanked. She wrote to her, as one person writes to another person they think they might, given time and circumstance, be able to know properly. The letter arrived in St. Catharines on a cold March morning, and Amma read it at the table by the lamp before work, and then she put it in the drawer with the other things she kept. Then she put on her coat and went to the office on Division Street and opened the accounts for the day. Outside, the canal ran quiet and dark through the town. The bare trees on the street were beginning, almost imperceptibly, to bud. Not open yet, just the earliest thickening at the branch tips that signals intention, the promise of what is coming before it actually arrives. The whole season stood in that gap. Everything that would happen was preparing itself, quietly, without announcement, in the cold March air above the canal, above the street, above the tailor's shop where a woman with a drawer full of kept things was walking down the stairs to begin another ordinary, specific, entirely her own day. The first fishing boats of her childhood had come in before dawn, when the harbor was still gray and the world had not yet decided whether it was night or morning. Her father would lift her onto his shoulders so she could see over the heads of the other people on the dock. She remembered the height of it, the slight sway, the boats appearing out of the mist one at a time, each one a separate arrival, each one somebody coming home from somewhere difficult and cold. She had not been on her father's shoulders for 15 years. She had been in holds and yards and fields and hidden wagons and small rooms and cold churches and an office on Division Street. She was here now. It was Tuesday in March, and she had accounts to balance, and the canal was running dark and fast outside the window, and a letter was in the drawer upstairs from a woman she had never spoken more than 12 words to, and somehow already understood. The buds were happening. Not open, not yet, but happening. The book Margaret Whitfield was writing took 2 more years to complete. She revised it 4 times, threw out 2 entire sections and rewrote them from scratch, and once stood over the desk at 2 in the morning and was so close to burning the whole thing that she had actually carried 3 pages to the fireplace before she changed her mind and carried them back. She did not burn it. Arthur Pennock published it in 1847. He ran a first printing of 400 copies, which he told her was ambitious for the kind of book it was, and she told him she would settle for 4 if the 4 were the right ones. The first 400 sold in 6 weeks. He ran a second printing. The book did not make her famous. Fame requires a kind of concentrated public attention that was, in 1847, directed almost entirely at men. What it made her was read, seriously, specifically read, by people who passed it on and made notes in the margins, and wrote to her in care of Pennock's address, letters she answered whenever she could, and kept whenever they said something true. One review, in a Boston newspaper, described the book as the work of a person who had stood close enough to a large and terrible thing to smell it, and had been precise enough to write down what it smelled like. Margaret cut out the review and kept it. She was not sure if it was a compliment, but she was sure it was accurate, and accurate was what she had aimed for. She was writing a second book before the first was out of its second printing. This was how she worked. She was always already somewhere ahead of the finished thing, living in the next question. In 1848, 3 years after the Tuesday morning in Crane's Yard, Margaret Whitfield moved into a small apartment of her own on Arch Street in Philadelphia. It had 2 rooms and a kitchen and a window that faced south, which meant good writing light from morning until mid-afternoon. She arranged it sparingly. Desk, chair, lamp, a bookshelf she built herself from boards and brackets, a narrow bed in the back room, a very good pot for the kitchen. She lived there alone, which was considered unusual for an unmarried woman of 29, and she did not consider it unusual at all. She had by this time established a correspondence with 11 people she considered, in various degrees and ways, genuine friends. Clara Holt was one. Arthur Pennock was one. Her cousin Helen in Richmond was one, though that correspondence required careful navigation because Helen was by nature conventional, and by affection loyal to Margaret, and the intersection of those 2 qualities produced some very interesting letters. Amma was one. They had been writing to each other for 2 years. The letters were not long. Both of them had the same instinct toward compression, the same habit of putting the essential thing into the smallest space. But they were regular, and over 2 years they had built out of that regularity a picture of each other that was, if not complete, genuine. Margaret knew about Paul Weston and the accounts and Bertha Marchand and the French and Cecile from next door, who had now taught Amma a song that Amma described as technically in French but philosophically baffling. Amma knew about the book and the second printing and Clara Holt and the apartment on Arch Street and the south-facing window. They knew each other, at a distance, imperfectly, in the specific way that is only possible through letters, which is to say, they knew the considered version of each other, the version that has had time to think about what it wants to say and how it wants to say it. In the winter of 1849, Amma wrote a letter that was slightly longer than usual. She wrote that she had been asked to help organize a small school, just a room in a church, 2 evenings a week, for children in the community who had no other access to lessons. She wrote that she was going to do it, though she had never taught anything in her life. She wrote that she was nervous about this, which was information she rarely put in letters, because it felt like the kind of thing that required explanation, and she did not like explaining herself. But she wrote it. She wrote, "I am not sure what I know that is worth teaching, but I know that knowing things matters, and that not knowing things is a specific kind of weakness that can be used against you. I know that because it was used against me. I would rather not have children not know things." Margaret read this letter at the desk in the south-facing window on Arch Street, on a January morning with snow on the ground outside and good light. She read it twice, then she wrote back. She wrote 3 paragraphs. The third one said, "You know exactly what is worth teaching, and you know this because you spent 3 years in conditions designed to remove your ability to know things, and you survived them in possession of more knowledge than almost anyone I have encountered who has lived in comfort their entire lives. Teach them everything." Amma read this at the table above the tailor's shop, which was still her table, even though she could now have afforded something larger, and had simply not bothered to move because she liked the room. She read the letter, and then she sat quietly for a moment, in the way she sat when something had landed true. Then she put the letter in the drawer. She had a good collection in that drawer now. The school started that spring. It met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings in the back room of St. Paul's, and Amma ran it with the same systematic precision she brought to Paul Weston's accounts. She taught arithmetic. She taught reading. She taught, at the insistence of a girl of 9 named Violet who could already read and wanted something harder, the beginning of French grammar. She taught the children to ask questions and not to accept answers that didn't hold up. She taught them that a correct answer is a thing you earn, not a thing you're given, and that the earning of it belongs to you in a way that a gift does not. Violet, who was 9 and had opinions about everything, told her this was the most useful thing anyone had ever explained to her. Amma considered this the best review she had received of anything she had ever done. The school grew. By its second year, it had 20 students on Tuesday evenings and a waiting list for Thursday. The church gave them a larger room. A woman named Dorothy Sims, who had been a schoolteacher in Virginia before she came north, heard about what Amma was doing and offered to help 2 evenings a month. Amma accepted. The year 1851 was a difficult one for people who had traveled the route Amma had traveled, because a law had been passed south of the border that made everything more dangerous and more complicated, and required the people in the network to rethink and rebuild and operate with even greater care. Amma followed the news of this through Henry Moss, who had continued to coordinate arrivals and who understood the practical implications better than anyone. She offered to help with accounting for the safe houses. There were costs, always costs, for the network to function, and Henry accepted. She did this quietly, as she did everything. She did not think of it as paying a debt. She had not incurred a debt. She thought of it as choosing where to put her precision. Margaret was in Boston when the same law passed. She was there for a speaking engagement. Pennock had persuaded her, against her considerable resistance, to give a public lecture on her work. She had stood on a platform in a meeting hall that held 300 people and felt the absolute wrongness of being visible, and she had done it anyway because the work required it, and she was getting better at doing things that were wrong for her personally because the work required them. The lecture went well, which she found annoying, because she had been hoping it would be a disaster so she could stop doing them. Instead, Pennock booked her for 3 more. In the carriage back to her hotel, she wrote the beginning of her 3rd book on the back of the lecture notes. She had not intended to write a 3rd book. It appeared anyway, the way ideas always appeared for her, not when she was sitting down to think about them, but when she was doing something else, and her brain slipped sideways into the gap where the idea had been waiting. She wrote, "The thing about the law is not the law itself. The thing is the argument that produces it. The argument that says certain human beings require managing rather than respecting. That says the appropriate response to a person is calculation rather than recognition. This argument is not new. It is very old. It appears in different costumes in different eras, but it is always the same argument, and it always ends the same way." She wrote 4 pages on the way back to the hotel. Then she turned the lecture notes over and gave the speech text one more read to make sure nothing had been left out. She was still annoying herself by being good at this. By 1855, Amma had been in St. Catharines for a decade. A decade is long enough to become indistinguishable from a place, to become part of its texture rather than a new arrival in it. She knew the town the way she had learned to know things, methodically, specifically, from the inside out. She had married. This had happened in 1852, somewhat to her own surprise, to a man named Daniel Cole, who was a carpenter from New Brunswick who had come to St. Catharines for work and stayed because of Amma. A sequence of events that Daniel described as the best accident of his life, and that Amma described, more precisely, as a sequence of considered decisions they had each made independently and then arrived at together. Daniel was a quiet man who was good with his hands and had strong opinions about the quality of wood and no opinions whatsoever about most of the things that other men spent a great deal of time arguing about. He had been born free, in a free place, and had grown up with a freedom that was so taken for granted it was nearly invisible to him, and he was a man honest enough to acknowledge this gap in understanding, and careful enough to try to bridge it. He was not always successful, but he was always trying, which Amma respected more than success. They had 2 children, a son, first, whom they named James, and who had Daniel's hands and Amma's eyes, and the particular quality of absolute physical confidence that children have when they have grown up knowing that the ground will hold. And then a daughter, born 2 years after James, whom they named after nobody and called Nora, because she was just Nora. That was entirely evident from the first day. She was simply and completely Nora. Amma had not expected children. She had not planned them. She had spent too long in conditions where planning children would have been a cruelty to herself, and she had trained herself out of wanting things that could be used against her. Children could be used against a person more completely than almost anything else. She had seen this. But here they were, James and Nora. She looked at them sometimes with something that had no smaller name than astonishment, that these 2 specific people existed in the world, that they were making noise in her house and demanding her attention and growing taller every month, that they were entirely theirs and entirely themselves simultaneously. It was astonishing. She had not yet found a way to be less astonished by it, and she was not certain she wanted to. She wrote to Margaret about James when he was born. She wrote a short letter, 3 paragraphs. The third one said, "He sleeps with his arms above his head. I watched him for an hour last night because I did not know what else to do. I am not sure I know anything about what comes next. I know this is universal, but it does not feel universal." Margaret wrote back, "It does not feel universal because it is not, in the specific way. The universal version is just the architecture. The specific version is only ever yours." She wrote this from the Arch Street apartment, which was by now very much her apartment. Dense with books, well used, smelling of ink and coffee and the particular musty warmth of a room that has been thought in for a long time. She had been here 7 years. She had written 2.5 books in it, given more lectures than she cared to count, and established a correspondence that now spanned 14 people on 2 continents. She was 36 years old. She was not yet what the people who would later write about her would call significant, because significance in this period required time and accretion, and the slow work of ideas finding their readers and their readers finding their way to the other ideas that the first ideas had made possible. She was still in the middle of the work, which is the hardest place to be because you cannot see the shape of it yet. She could only keep going. She kept going. The autumn of 1860 arrived in Philadelphia with unusual warmth that stretched into October and then broke all at once into cold. Margaret was 41. She had published 3 books and was halfway through a 4th. Her hair had gone gray at the temples in the last 2 years, which she had not noticed until Clara Holt pointed it out with the directness that was Clara's specific form of affection. The country around her was loud with the particular noise of a thing that has been breaking for a long time and is now near the point of breaking completely. She had been writing about the argument at the center of this breaking thing for 15 years. She had been precise about it, careful about it, rigorous about it, and she was tired of being careful about it. She was ready to write about it in a way that was less careful and more direct. She was in the middle of this when the letter came from St. Catherine's that changed the color of everything. Amma wrote that James was 11 now and learning mathematics at a school that had expanded significantly since its 2-evening-a-week beginning. She wrote that Nora was 9 and had, without anyone suggesting it, begun learning French from Berthe Marchand, who was now in her 70s and furious about everything, and still the best teacher on the street. She wrote that Daniel had finished building the addition to the school's main room, and that it was good solid work, as his work always was. And then, at the end of the letter, in a paragraph that began without transition and ended the same way, Amma wrote, "I have been thinking about what it means to have built a thing here. I do not mean the school or the accounts or the children, though I mean all of those too. I mean something harder to name. I came here with nothing that was mine, and I have made things that are mine, and I am trying to understand what that process actually is. I think you might be writing about it in that book you are always about to finish. I think that might be what it is about. I think we are both writing about the same thing from different ends of it." Margaret read this on a Tuesday morning in October. She read it 3 times. Then she went to the window and looked at the street and was very quiet for a long time. She had been trying to find the end of the 4th book. She had known for months what the beginning was and what the middle was and what the argument was, but she had not been able to find the end. It had been there somewhere. She knew it had been there. She had been circling it for weeks. She went back to the desk. She picked up the pen. She wrote. What she said was this. Then she wrote, From memory, the paragraph from Amma's letter. Not as a quote, but as the truth of the thing. The exact center of what the book was about, arrived at from the other side of an ocean, and a decade and 2 children, and a winter that had been longer than anything she previously understood winter to mean. She wrote from that center outward, and she wrote for 5 hours, and at the end of 5 hours she had the end of the book. She put down the pen. She went to the kitchen and made tea. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it. Then she sat down and wrote a letter to a woman in Ontario, and the letter was longer than any letter she had written before, and in it she told the truth about what the book was actually about, and why she had not been able to find the end of it, and how the paragraph from Amma's letter had been the thing that opened it, and she said that she thought Amma was right, that they had been writing about the same thing from different ends, and she said she wanted to say this directly rather than let it sit unsaid. She said, "I think what we are both writing about is how a person makes something that is theirs out of conditions that were designed to take everything from them. I think you have been writing this with your life, and I have been writing it with words, and I think the version you have written is the one that actually matters." She sent the letter. She did not know how long it would take to arrive. A week, perhaps, maybe more. She went back to the desk and continued working. The 4th book was finished by December. It was the best thing she had written. She knew this with the absolute flat certainty of a person who has been working at something long enough to know what good feels like. Pennock read it in 2 days and sent her a letter that said only, yes. She started the 5th book in January. In St. Catharines, the letter from Margaret arrived on a Thursday evening, after the school session had ended and the children had gone home, and Amma was at the table with a cup of tea and the accounts for the week. She read it once, straight through, without stopping. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a while. Then she opened the drawer and put it with the others. Nora came in from the back room where she had been doing something involving string and a great deal of concentration, and climbed into the chair across from her mother and looked at her. Nora at 9 was a person of considerable perceptiveness, which she deployed constantly and without apology. "Letter?" she said. "From Philadelphia," Amma said. "From the woman who writes the books?" "Yes." Nora considered this. "Is she nice?" Amma thought about this for a moment, with the seriousness the question deserved. "She is precise," she said, "and honest, and those are better than nice." Nora considered this. "Can I meet her someday?" Amma looked at her daughter's face, which had Daniel's directness and something else that was harder to name, a quality of forward-facingness, of being always interested in what was ahead. She thought about what it meant to have a daughter who looked at the world as if it were full of things she was going to understand. "I expect so," Amma said. She did not know yet if this was true. She hoped it was. She picked up her pen and started a new letter. The letters did not stop. Over the following years, as the country below the border went through the violence of its breaking and its remaking, the letters continued to travel between Arch Street in Philadelphia and the street above the tailor's shop in St. Catharines, though Amma and Daniel had long since moved into a house of their own, bigger, with a proper study for Amma's accounts, and a workbench in the backyard for Daniel's wood. The address changed. The letters did not stop. Margaret moved out of Philadelphia in 1863 to a smaller town further north, because the city had gotten loud in a way that made it hard to think, and she needed quiet. She brought the desk and the bookshelf she had built and the lamp and the 2 good chairs, and the drawer full of letters and nothing else that mattered. She wrote her 6th book in the new town, and her 7th. She lived alone, which was still considered unusual by people who considered such things, and she did not consider it unusual at all. She had Clara Holt, who visited twice a year and whose letters came every other week. She had Arthur Pennock, who was by now very old and had handed the Northern Review to his son, who was not as interesting as his father but was earnest and worked hard. She had her cousin Helen, who had never once acknowledged the auction in Richmond in any letter she had written, but who had sent Margaret a cutting from her garden every spring for 20 years, dried between sheets of waxed paper, and Margaret had kept every one. And she had the letters from St. Catharines. In 1867, Amma wrote that the school had formally expanded. It had moved into a building of its own, a small building, purchased by the church with funds raised over 3 years by the community, with 2 rooms and proper windows, and a wood stove that actually worked. Dorothy Sims was now teaching full-time. Amma was on the board that oversaw it. There were 43 children enrolled. The waiting list had 12 names. She wrote this in 2 paragraphs, which was her way of indicating that it was significant. 2 paragraphs meant something mattered. She also wrote, in a 3rd paragraph, that James was now 18 and had taken a job with a surveying firm in Toronto, which was the kind of work that required him to walk long distances in all weather and measure things with precision, and that she considered this an entirely appropriate occupation for a person of his particular combination of patience and exactness. She wrote that she had cried when he left, which she had not expected to do, and had done anyway, standing in the doorway watching the cart go down the street, very quietly, and without moving her face. She wrote this to Margaret because Margaret was the person she told true things to. Margaret wrote back about the school and about James, and also, at the end, about a conversation she had attended in Boston the month before, where a group of people who were doing various kinds of work related to the moment the country was in had been gathered together to talk about what came next. She wrote that she had sat in this group and listened carefully, and thought carefully about what was being said, and she had had the specific experience of knowing exactly what she wanted to say, and choosing not to say it, and that this choice, which she had made because the people in the room needed to say the things they were saying and she did not want to interrupt the particular quality of the conversation, had felt like a kind of maturity she was not sure she had possessed 10 years ago. She wrote, "I think I am learning, very slowly, that the most powerful thing I can contribute to a conversation is sometimes to hear it rather than to speak in it. This is not something that comes naturally to me. I am mentioning it because I suspect it is something you learned long before I did, and I am noting the learning now." Amma read this at her desk in the evening and felt something that she would describe, if asked, only as recognition. She wrote back, "Yes. You learn it when you have to. It is not a virtue. It is a skill. Virtue is when you choose it freely." Margaret read this at her desk in the quiet town north of Philadelphia, and held it in her mind for a long time. Then she wrote it in her journal, with attribution. She wrote it in her journal because she knew that Amma was right, and she wanted to make sure she did not forget it. Amma found the letter from the church archive in a winter she did not expect to be the last one her health was fully reliable for. She was 63, and she had lived a life that had put certain specific stresses on her body that had accumulated quietly, and were now making themselves known in the usual ways of accumulated stresses. A tiredness that did not fully lift, a cough that arrived in autumn, and stayed too long. She was not alarmed by this, she was watchful. There was a difference. Daniel, who was now 68, and had the joints of a man who had spent 50 years working with his hands in all weathers, had the good sense to worry without performing the worry, which was the only kind she could tolerate. He made sure there was enough wood for the fire. He made sure she ate. He said nothing about any of this because he knew her well enough to know that naming it would make it something to argue about. Nora was 31 and lived in Hamilton with her husband and 2 children of her own. She visited every month, which was Amma's doing. She had made it clear to Nora from the time the children were old enough to travel that monthly visits were what she expected, and Nora had accepted this the way she accepted all of her mother's stated positions, which was with a brief considering silence followed by agreement, because Nora was Amma's daughter in the most fundamental ways. James came when he could, which was less often because his work took him to different places, but when he came he stayed for days and walked with his father in the morning and sat with his mother in the evening, and told her about what he was measuring, and where and how the land looked different in different seasons when you were walking across it. She liked hearing this. She was in the study on a February evening, working on the accounts for the school, which still met, still had 40-something students, still had Dorothy Sims, who was now 70 and showed no signs of being done, when she found, tucked into the back of the church's general ledger, a folded piece of paper that she did not put there. She unfolded it. It was a record, handwritten, brief, a founding document for the school, dated 1849, listing the founding committee. 3 names, her name first, then Dorothy's, then a third name she did not recognize, a woman's name, with a note next to it saying she had moved away in 1851. She had been the first name on the list. She had not known she had been the first name on the list. Someone had put the names down without making much of the order, and the document had gone into the back of the ledger and stayed there for 18 years. She sat with it for a while. She was not the kind of person who required recognition, and she was not feeling it now. What she was feeling was more specific, the experience of being surprised by evidence of her own history. The school was in its 18th year. 43 children had graduated from it and gone into their lives with the things they had learned in the 2 rooms above the church and then in the building with the proper windows. She could list them by name, the ones she remembered, which was most of them. She could list what each of them had been good at. She folded the document and put it in her desk drawer. Then she wrote to Margaret. She wrote about the document and what it felt like to find it. She wrote that she had been thinking about what it meant to have built a thing, and that building things was different from the building itself. The building happened in increments, too small to see clearly while they were happening. And then one day you find a piece of paper from 18 years ago with your name at the top, and you understand that you have been building for 18 years, and that the building is standing. She wrote, "I did not think about this when I was doing it. I was just doing it. I think this is probably the only way it can be done." She sealed the letter and sent it. Margaret received it on a March morning. She was 63 herself now, and she was working on what she had come to privately think of as possibly the last book, not because she had given up on writing, but because she was beginning to understand that there was a thing she had been trying to say since the first pamphlet, and she had been getting progressively closer to it, and she felt that this book was the closest she had come, and that when it was done, the thing would finally have been fully said. She read Amma's letter at the desk. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the March morning, which was pale and cold and entirely ordinary. She thought, 18 years ago this woman came out of a hidden wagon and climbed down to a barn floor and accepted a cup of broth from a stranger, and started the next thing. And the thing she had started was still standing. She picked up her pen. She wrote the last chapter of the book from there. She wrote it in a single long morning, and when she was done she read it back and thought, yes, this is the thing. The thing was, the act of building something permanent is almost always done by people who are not thinking about permanence. It is done by people who are thinking about the next morning, the next problem, the next room of children who need to know that a correct answer belongs to the person who earns it. Permanence is not the goal. The goal is the next specific thing, and permanence is what you discover, sometimes 18 years later, in the back of a ledger. She sent the manuscript to the publisher in Philadelphia. She wrote the dedication last. The dedication said, "For A, who has been writing the same book from the other end." She did not put a full name. She did not need to. Amma would know. And she did. The letter Amma sent in response was the shortest she had ever written. It was 2 sentences. She wrote, "I know what you mean. I have known for a long time.